Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. This is part 4 of the Historical Blackout, and part 2, let's see, this is 3, where are we starting here? Part 2 of Revisionism and the Historical Blackout. Okay. Ignoring or obscuring revisionist books. In case a revisionist book squeezes through the publishing blackout almost invariably as a result of the courage of the two small publishing companies mentioned above, the blackout strategies are well prepared to circumvent the possibility of it gaining any wide circulation or popular acceptance. The most common procedure is to accord such books the silent treatment, namely to refuse to review them at all. As one powerful pressure group has pointed out, this is the most effective way of nullifying the potential influence of any book. Even highly hostile and critical reviews attract attention to a book and may arouse controversy which will further publicize it. The silent treatment assures a stillbirth to virtually any volume. The late Oswald Garrison Villard recounts his own personal experience with the silent treatment strategy of editors today. Quote, I rang myself up at a magazine which some months previously had asked me to review a book for them and asked if they would accept another review from me. The answer was yes, of course. What book had you in mind? I replied, Morgenstern's Pearl Harbor. Oh, that's the new book attacking FDR, isn't it? Yes. Well, how do you stand on it? I believe since this book is based on the records of the Pearl Harbor Inquiry, he's right. Oh, we don't handle books of that type. It is against our policy to do so, end quote. The Henry Regency Company of Chicago has been more courageous and prolific in the publications of substantial revisionist books than any other concern here or abroad. It has brought out such important books as Leonard von Merlz from Versailles to Potsdam, Hans Rothfeld's The German Opposition to Hitler, Victor Gollancz's In Darkest Germany, Freda Utle's The High Cost of Vengeance, Montgomery Belgion's Victor's Justice, Lord Hackney's Politics, Trials and Errors, William Henry Chamberlain's American Second Crusade, and Charles Cahill Tanson's Backdoor to War. Mr. Regnery has shown me a careful survey of the treatment accorded these books by our leading newspapers and periodicals. Some have not been reviewed at all. Most of them were reviewed sparingly. Almost invariably, when they had been noticed, they had been attacked with great ferocity and uniform unfairness. The obscuring of the neo-revisionist material may further be illustrated by the space and position assigned to the reviews of Beard's American Foreign Policy in the Making, 1932 to 1940, and Morgenstern's Pearl Harbor in the American Historical Review, and in other leading newspapers and periodicals. Despite the revolutionary nature and vast importance of the Beard book, it was given only a page in the American Historical Review. But amusingly enough, the reviewer used the brief space at his disposal to praise the book. This was not allowed to happen again. Though Morgenstern's book was perhaps the most important single volume published in the field of American history in the year 1947, it was relegated to a book note in the American Historical Review and was roundly smeared. Of all the book reviewing columns in the New York City papers, only one reviewed Morgenstern's book and he smeared it. The Saturday Review of Literature ignored it completely, and so did most of the other leading periodicals. Though many infinitely less important books from the standpoint of timelessness and intrinsic merit of content received front-page positions therein, neither the Morgenstern book nor the Beard volume was given this place in the Sunday book review section of the New York Times or Herald Tribune. Had these books ardently defended the Roosevelt legend, they would assuredly have been assigned front-page positions. As Oswald Villard remarked of the Beard volume, had it been a warm approval of FDR and his war methods, I will wager whatever press standing I have that it would have been featured on the first pages of the Herald Tribune books in the Times literary section and received unbounded praise from Walter Millis, Alan Nevins, and other similar axemen. Mr. Villard's prophecy was vindicated after his death, when the supreme effort to salvage the reputation of Roosevelt and his foreign policy appears in W. L. Longer and S. E. Gleason's Challenge to Isolation, 1937 to 1940. It was promptly placed on the front page of the Herald Tribune book review on January the 20th, 1952, and praised in lavish fashion. Beard's book on President Roosevelt and in the Coming of the War, 1941, was so challenging that it could not be ignored. But it did not gain front-page position in either the New York Times or the Herald Tribune. Though reviewed in a number of newspapers and periodicals, the majority of the reviewers sought to discredit the book rather than to examine its facts and arguments in spite of fairness and integrity. Chamberlain's American Second Crusade was nowhere near as widely reviewed as the significance of the content of the book merited, irrespective of whether or not one agreed with all the author's conclusions. It was the first comprehensive and critical appraisal of the nature and results of the most monumental project in which the United States was ever involved politically, economically, or militarily. Hence, it merited careful and extended examination by every newspaper and periodical in the land. But it was reviewed in only a fraction of the leading newspapers, while most of the important periodicals, including the American Historical Review, ignored it completely. In the 1920s, periodicals like the New Republic and the Nation would have reviewed a book on this type lyrically and at great length, and in all probability have published special articles and editorials praising it warmly. Most reviews which the Chamberlain book reviewed were of the smearing variety. The New York Times and the Herald Tribune both reviewed the book in hostile fashion, gave it very brief reviews, and placed them in an obscure position. Frederick R. Sanborn's able and devastating Design for War received about the same treatment as the Chamberlain volume. It was ignored by the great majority of the newspapers and by virtually all the important periodicals. The New York Times reviewed the book rather promptly, if not conspicuously, but handed it over to their leading academic hatchet man, Samuel Flagg Bemis. Though prodded by Sanborn, the Herald Tribune delayed the review from March to August and then assigned it to Gordon A. Craig, a leading anti-revisionist among the historians frequently employed by the Times and Herald Tribune in attacking books critical of Roosevelt foreign policy. Sanborn's book was not reviewed at all by Time, Newsweek, The New Yorker, The Nation, The New Republic, Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, or the Saturday Review of Literature, though Sanborn wrote letters of inquiry to all of them. Correspondence with the Saturday Review of Literature from April to the end of September failed to produce a review. If a comparable book had happened at any time between 1923 and 1935, there is every reason to believe that the Nation and the New Republic, for example, would have hailed it with near hysterical joy and given excessive space to praising and promoting it. The American Historical Review did not review or even notice the Sanborn volume. So far as can be ascertained at the time, the lines are revised. December 1952, Charles Kayland Tansel's The Backdoor War was treated by the press in essentially the same manner as it had handled the Chamberlain and Sanborn volumes. Although it is the definitive revisionist contribution and deserves as much consideration as Sidney B. Fay's Origins of the World War received in 1928. It received slightly more attention than did Chamberlain and Sanborn in the newspapers, perhaps because a determined effort was made to get the book in hands of the editor of every important newspaper in the country. The majority of the newspaper reviews were of a smearing nature. As one example of such a review by interventionist newspaper, we may cite the following from the San Francisco Chronicle of July the 27th, 1952. To bring forth a very small mouse, Professor Tansel has labored mountainously to assemble this helter-skelter collection of facts, documents, and hearsay about American pre-war foreign policy. This book is not history. It is awkward special pleading. The author of the review hid behind the initials MS. The book failed to make the front page of either the New York Times Book Review or the New York Herald Tribune Book Review. It was reviewed on page 3 of the former, May 11, 1952, and on page 10 of the latter, June 1st, 1952. Rather briefly in both cases. Even so, Dexter Perkins, who reviewed the book for the Times, had to request twice the space originally assigned. Among the important periodicals, only the Freeman, the Saturday Review of Literature, and the Nation reviewed the book, the latter two rather belatedly. Time, Newsweek, The Atlantic, and Harper's give the volume the silent treatment, ignoring it entirely. The editor of the New Republic treated the book to an almost obscene smear. In the 1920s, all of these periodicals, which were then in existence, would have reviewed the book promptly and at length, and it would have evoked almost frenzied ecstasy on the part of the Nation and the New Republic. The jaundiced and biased attitudes of periodicals in reviewing or ignoring such books as these was well revealed at the time of the appearance of the ardently pro-Roosevelt masterpiece by W.L. Langer and S.E. Gleason, Challenge to Isolation, 1937 to 1940. In this instance, virtually all of the magazines which had ignored the books by Morgenstern, Chamberlain, Sanborn, and Tansel immediately rushed into print with prominent and lyrical reviews of the Langer-Gleason volume. Among all the editors of professional journals in the historical and social science field, only Professor Howard W. Odum, editor of Social Forces, has been willing to open his publication to full and fair reviewing of revisionist volumes. One of the most impressive examples of the ignoring and obscuring of the writings of men critical of our foreign policy since 1937 is presented by the case of Francis Nielsen. Mr. Nielsen is a distinguished publicist, and he served as a member of Parliament before he came to the United States. He was the principal angel of the original Freeman, and like John T. Flynn, was once a darling of American liberals who were in those days revisionists and anti-war interventionists. Mr. Nielsen's How Diplomats Make War, 1915, was the first revisionist volume to be published on the First World War, and it is still read with respect. When Mr. Nielsen opposed our intervention after 1937, his erstwhile liberal friends fell away from him. Being a man of means, he was able to publish his gigantic 5-volume work, The Tragedy of Europe, privately. It was scarcely noticed in any review, though it was praised by no less personage than President Robert Maynard Hutchinson of the University of Chicago. In 1950, Mr. Nielsen published, again privately, the condensation of the more vital portion of his larger work, entitling it The Makers of War. The book contains a great amount of valuable revisionist material not embodied in any other revisionist volume on the Second World War. But Mr. Nielsen assured me privately it has never been reviewed at all. 4. Smearing revisionist books. When, rather rarely, and for one reason or another, a newspaper or periodical decides actually to review a revisionist book rather than to accord it the silent treatment, it has available a large supply of hatchetmen who can be relied upon to attack and smear revisionist volumes and to eulogize the work of court historians and others who seek to perpetrate the traditional mythology. For example, the New York Times has its own staff of such hatchetmen, among them Otto D. Talicious, Charles Poor, Orville Prescott, Carl Schriftgeister, Drew Middleton, and others. When these do not suffice, it can call upon academicians of similar inclinations, such as Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., Alan Nevins, Henry Steele Commager, Gordon A. Craig, Samuel Flagg Bemis, Dexter Perkins, and others. The Herald Tribune has Walter Millis, August Hacksher, and their associates on its staff, and also turns to such academicians as these mentioned above, whose gifts and talents are not limited to the times. The smearing device used almost universally in discrediting neo-revisionist books is a carryover of the propaganda strategy perfected by Charles Michelson. In political technique and extended by Joseph Goebbels, John Ray Carlson, and others, namely seeking to destroy the reputation of an opponent by associating him, however unfairly, with some odious quality, attitude, policy, or personality, even though this may be nothing to do with the vital facts in the situation. It is only a complex and skillful application of the old adage about giving a dog a bad name. This is an easy and facile procedure, for it all too often effectively disposes of an opponent without involving the onerous responsibility of facing the facts. The Blackout Boys have even implied that the effort to tell the truth about responsibility for the Second World War is downright wicked. Samuel Flagg Bemis declared that such an excursion into intellectual integrity is serious, unfortunate, deplorable. Inasmuch as the Morgenstern book was the first to shake the foundations of the interventionist wartime propaganda, and because Morgenstern is not a professional historian of long time standing, his work was greeted with an avalanche of smears. Virtually the only fair reviews of the Morgenstern volume were those by Edwin M. Borchardt, George A. Lundberg, Harry Paxson Howard, and Admiral H. E. Yarnell. There was rarely any effort whatever to wrestle with the vast array of facts and documentary evidence which both Beard and Admiral Yarnell maintained bore out all of Morgenstern's essential statements and conclusions. Rather, he was greeted with an almost unrivaled volley of smears. Some reviewers rested content with pointing out that Morgenstern is a young man and hence cannot be supposed to know much, even though the New York Times handed over to Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., a young man, the responsibility for reviewing Beard's great book on President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, 1941. Another reviewer asserted that all that needed to be said to refute and silence the book was to point out that Morgenstern is employed by the Chicago Tribune. Others stressed the fact that he is only an amateur, dabbling with documents without the training afforded by the graduate historical seminar. while Morgenstern was an honor student of history at the University of Chicago. It was apparent to unbiased readers that most of the professors who reviewed his book departed entirely from any seminar canons of research and criticism which they may have earlier mastered. Morgenstern surely worked and wrote in closer conformity to von Ranke's exhortations than his professorial reviewers. Other reviewers sought to dispose of Morgenstern's book by stating that it was bitterly partisan, was composed in a state of blind anger, or written with unusual asperity, though it is actually the fact that Morgenstern is a far less bitter, angry, or blind than his reviewers. Indeed, the tone of his book is more one of the urbane satire than of indignation. Few books of this type have been freer of any taint of wrath or fury. The attitudes of such reviewers is a good example of what the psychologists call the mechanism of projection. The reviewers attribute to Morgenstern the blind anger that they themselves felt when compelled to face the truth. In reviewing the book for the Infantry Journal, May 1947, Harvey A. DeWeerd declared that it was the most flagrant example of slanted history, that it had come to his attention in recent years. But he failed to make it clear that the uniqueness in the slanting of Morgenstern's book was that it was slanted towards the truth, something which was, and still is, quite unusual in historical writings on this theme. Probably the most complete smearing of the Morgenstern book was performed by Walter Millis in the Herald Tribune Book Review, February the 9th, 1947. Though with all the extensive space at his disposal, he made no serious effort to come to grips with the facts in the situation. He merely elaborated the smear in the caption, twisting the Pearl Harbor story. A documented brief for a highly biased, bitter, cynical view. Gordon A. Craig of Princeton, reviewing the book in the New York Times, February the 9th, 1947, rested content with stating that the book was no more than an anti-Roosevelt mythology, and completely unbelievable, though he adduced no relevant evidence in support of these assertions. One of the most remarkable attacks on the book was made by one-time ardent revisionist historian Oron J. Hale in the Annals of the American Academy, July 1947. After first assailing the book with the charge of bitter partisanship and asserting that the author made only a fake parade of the externals of scholarship, Hale sought manfully but futilely to find serious errors in Morgenstern's materials. He then concluded that all or most of the statements in the book were true, but that the book as a whole was a great untruth. This reverses the usual line of the current apologists for the Roosevelt foreign policy like Thomas A. Bailey, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., who now agree that most of Roosevelt's public statements thereupon were untrue, but that its program as a whole was a great truth, which exemplified the desirable procedure of the good officer, the conscientious public servant. The fact that Morgenstern is an editorial writer for the Chicago Tribune and that the Tribune has opened its column to revisionist writings has encouraged the smearbun to seek indefinitely revisionism, and all other revisionist writers with the Tribune. Even Beard's books were charged with being dominated by the Tribune policy. Only recently, a reviewer in the New Yorker linked Beard and the Tribune and referred to the Charles Austin Beard Chicago Tribune view of war origins. Max Lerner wrote that the man who once mercifully flayed Hearst became the darling of McCormick. No phase of the smear campaign could well be more preposterous. Aside from being willing to accept the truth relative to the Roosevelt foreign policy, Beard and the Tribune had little in common. The American Civil Liberties Union once warmly praised Colonel McCormick for his valiant battle against the Minnesota press gag. There was no attempt then to link the Civil Liberties Union with the total editorial policy of the Tribune. Roger Baldwin was not portrayed as a tool of Colonel McCormick, nor was there any hint of a Civil Liberties Union McCormick axis. Those who wrote in behalf of freedom of the press can always gain access to the columns of the Chicago Tribune, but there was no thought in such cases of linking them with total editorial policy of the Tribune. Due to the fact that Beard was a tainted and venerable scholar, due to the fact that Beard was a trained and venerable scholar, and hence obviously not a juvenile amateur in using historical documents, that he had a worldwide reputation as one of the most eminent and productive historians and political scientists the United States has ever produced, that he had served as a president of the American Political Science Association and of the American Historical Association, and that he was awarded in 1948 the gold medal of the National Institute of Arts and Letters for the best historical work of the preceding decade, it requires more than usual gall and trepidation to apply the smear technique to Beard and his two splendid books on American foreign policy. Yet Beard did not escape unscathed. Though his facts and objectivity cannot be validly challenged, As Lewis Martin Sears pointed out in the American Historical Review, quote, "The volume under review is said to give annoyance to the followers of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If that be true, their faith is scarcely founded upon a rock, for no more objective treatment could be readily conceived. The author nowhere injects a personal opinion," unquote. Any testimonials as to Beard's historical prowess are invariably a red flag to the Smearbund. Only this consolidation makes such things as Lewis Mumford's resignation from the National Institute of Arts and Letters because of the award of the above-mentioned medal to Beard or Harry D. Gideonsi's expedition in the New Leader at all explicable. The difficulty of attacking Beard relative to his status as a historian diverted most of the smearing of him into the allegation that his work is invalidated and unreliable because he was an isolationist. The absurdity of this charge is obvious. Beard did, from 1937 onward, courageously and sanely warn against the manner in which the Roosevelt policies were deliberately leading us into a foreign war against the will of the overwhelming mass of the American people in what was supposed to be a democratic system of government. Beard's stand may not have been wise, though the facts today overwhelmingly prove its soundness, but such an attitude has nothing to do whatever with any literal isolationism unless one defines internationalism as chronic meddling abroad and unwavering support of our entry into any extant foreign war. Any attempt to brand Beard as a literal isolationist is, of course, completely preposterous. Few men have had a wider international perspective or experience. In his early academic days, he helped to found Ruskin College, Oxford. He had traveled, advised, and been held in high esteem from Tokyo to Belgrade. The irresponsibility of this form of smearing Beard is well illustrated by the innuendo of Samuel Eliot Morison and Perry Miller that Beard was an ignorant isolationist with an archaic and naive view of world affairs because he was deaf and lived on a farm with his cows, thus implying that he had shut himself off from the world and human association and did not know what was going on about him. That such charges were utterly without foundation is well known to anybody with any knowledge whatever of Beard and his mode of life, and must have been known to be untrue by Admiral Morison and Professor Miller themselves. Beard provided himself with the most efficient hearing instrument, which enabled him to carry on personal conversations with the utmost facility. He probably enjoyed wider personal contact with scholars and publicists than any other American historian down to the day of his death. He was visited at his suburban home constantly by a stream of prominent academic and scholarly admirers. He traveled widely and spent his winters in North Carolina. His deafness did not affect his personal relations or scholarly interests in activities in the slightest. His mode of life, at the most, only gave him the occasional quiet and attachment needed to digest and interpret the mass of information which came to him as a result of his wide reading and his extensive personal contacts with American and foreign scholars, both young and old. His dairy farm was located some 20 miles from his home. I was present a few years ago at a conference on foreign affairs attended by 40 leading savants. Most of them wrung their hands about the sorry state of the world today, but only 2 or 3 were frank and candid enough to discern and admit that the majority of the conditions which they were so dolorously deploring stemmed directly from the foreign policies of Franklin D. Roosevelt. From a Chicago Bridge speech of October 1937 to the Yalta Conference of early 1945, Beard was assailed for his isolationism and cultural lag by both the chairman and the chief participant for no earthly reason save that he opposed the policies which had led to the chaos over which the conference was holding the coroner's inquest, but with no intention of declaring it a homicide or seeking the culprit. They vented their spleen on a man who had advised against risking the ambuscade which led to the murder. It is both vicious and silly to brand a person an isolationist merely because he opposed our entry into the Second World War. Personally, I opposed our entry with all the energy and power at my command, just as vigorously as did Beard. But it also happens that I wrote one of the longest chapters in the first important book ever published in behalf of the League of Nations, and that I have ever since supported any move or policy which seemed to me likely to promote international goodwill and world peace. Sane internationalism is one thing, and it's something quite different to support our entry into a war likely to ruin civilization, mainly to promote the political prospects of a domestic leader, however colorful and popular, to satisfy the neurotic compulsions of special interests and pressure groups, and to pull the chestnuts of foreign nations out of the fire. The whole issue of isolationism and the epithet isolationist has been a very effective phase of the smearing technique invented and applied by interventionists between 1937 and Pearl Harbor, and so naively exposed and betrayed by Walter Johnson in his book, The Battle Against Isolation. The absurd character of the whole process of smearing by the method of alleging isolationism has been devastatingly revealed by Charles A. Lundberg in his article on Semantics and International Relations and the American Perspective. Senator Taft put the matter in a nutshell when he asserted that to call any responsible person an isolationist today is nothing less than idiocy, one might add malicious idiocy. The only man of any intellectual importance who ever believed in isolationism was the German colonist Johann Heinrich von Thunen, 1783-1850, author of The Isolated State, 1826, and he espoused the idea only to provide the basis for formulating economic abstractions. In short, isolationism is nothing more than a semantic smear fiction invented by globaloni addicts. Governor Adlai E. Stevenson of Illinois is reported to have said in a commencement address in June 1952 that isolationism has not lost all of its emotional appeal, but it has lost its intellectual respectability. Unless one is willing to lapse completely into 1984 doublethink, it would seem that exactly the opposite is the truth. From Woodrow Wilson's war address on April 6, 1917, to President Truman's denunciation of cuts in the 1952 European aid allotment, interventionism has rested entirely on propaganda and emotional appeals. It has never been able to stand for a moment on the ground of empiricism, logic, and facts. If results are any test of the validity of a position, no program in human history has had less confirmation and vindication than has the intervention of the United States in foreign quarrels. On the other hand, isolationism, which means no more than international sanity and the avoidance of national suicide, has never been able to appeal to war excitement, the propaganda of fear, and other emotional fictions. It has always been compelled to rely upon reason and sanity. It may be that emotionalism is a better guide for public policy than rationality, but to claim that interventionism and globaloni can claim priority and respect to rationality is palpably preposterous. The internationalists of the earlier era, for whom I wrote and lectured from coast to coast for 20 years after 1918, were true believers in internationalism, goodwill, and peace, and worked to secure these objectives. The globaloni and interventionist crowd, while prattling about internationalism and peace, have done more than anybody else except the totalitarian dictators to promote nationalism and to revive and direct the war spirit. They have created an unprecedented spirit of internationalism, militarism, and intolerance in the United States, and have helped to provoke a similar development in Soviet Russia. While blatant nationalism was checked temporarily in Germany and Italy, it has been stimulated elsewhere, from England to Indochina, East Asia, and South Africa. The United Nations have steadily become more nationalistic and less united, and the world trembles and shivers on the brink of the Third World War before the peace treaties have all been negotiated to conclude the Second. There is also too much truth in the statement of an eminent publicist that Aldrich Hiss's long-continued activities as an aggressive internationalist of the recent vintage did far more harm to the United States than handing over any of the secret department files which he could have transcribed and transmitted to the Russians. The columnist J. Franklin has given us a good summary picture of the fruits of interventionism by contrasting the 20th century American casualty record under 5 isolationist Republican presidents and under 3 interventionist Democratic candidates. Republican presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, 1909 to 1901, 0 casualties. William H. Taft, 1909 to 1913, 0 casualties. Warren G. Harding, 1921 to 23, 0 casualties. Calvin Coolidge, 1923 to 29, 0 casualties. Herbert Hoover, 1929 to 1933, 0 casualties. Total for 24 years, 0 casualties. Democratic presidents: Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 21, 364,800 casualties. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933 to 45, 1,134,527 casualties. Harry Truman, 1945 to 53, 129,153 casualties, for a total of 1,628,480 casualties. Average U.S. war casualties, a total of 28 Democratic years. Average U.S. war casualties per Republican year, 0. Average U.S. war casualties per Democratic year, 58,160. Though Catholic circles have been unusually fair in tolerating the truth about the causes of the Second World War, the pressure of the editors was so great that even the enlightened Commonweal permitted Mason Wade to attack Beard in its columns. but the most irresponsible attempt to attack Beard as an isolationist came with almost uniquely bad taste from the pen of Harry D. Gideonsy, who reviewed Beard's President Roosevelt and the Coming of War in 1941 in The New Leader. Beard was a native-born American who labored mightily for over 50 years to improve many phases of American intellectual and public life. No American historian, past or present, had more honorable record as an active and effective intellectual patriot. He had never written a word which placed the interests of other nations above those of our country. Gideonsy, on the other hand, is a Dutch-born, surely an honorary paternity. But there is little evidence that he has ever become completely immersed in Americanism or has taken on a thoroughly American point of view. In his public statements over many years, he has always given evidence of a robust internationalism, which has little primary regard for American institutions or traditions. His internationalism appears to have a twofold basis: a hangover of the Dutch imperialism of the Dutch East India Company tycoons of the 17th and 18th centuries, and the virus of current American globaloney. Anyhow, it has paid off remarkably well, for Gideonsy was summoned from Chicago to Columbia University, and then, to the amazement even of his friends, suddenly catapulted to the presidency of Brooklyn College in 1939. While Gideonsy finds other non-factual grounds for assaulting Beard, he holds that Beard's alleged isolationism is all that is needed to brush the book aside. Indeed, all that is required for that is the fact, as Gideonsy tells us twice in the course of his review, that it has been praised as a very great book by the isolationist Chicago Tribune. It might be cogently observed that the Tribune has also praised the Bible, Shakespeare's works, and Einstein's writings on relativity. But Gideonsy has not laughed this off yet. If praised by the Chicago Tribune were not enough to destroy the validity of Beard's book, then in Gideonsy's view, it would be amply disposed of by the fact that he quotes, even sparingly, statements by eminent revisionists like Senator Burton K. Wheeler and Gerald P. Nye. Not even the fact which Gideonsy concedes, that he also cites Eleanor Roosevelt frequently and with respect, could redeem Beard after he had revealed his acquaintance with statements of allegedly nefarious isolationist personalities. Though, as we have made clear, reviewers have naturally been a trifle hesitant in daring to minimize Beard's status as a historian. Walter Millis and Gideonsy have not been dismayed or sidetracked even here. In his review of Beard's President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War in 1941, and the Herald Tribune Book Review, Millis contended that Beard is not entitled to rank as an objective historian according to formal academic fictions, but really belongs back with Tertullian, Orosius, Gregory of Tours, and other Dark Age examples of the devil theory of history. But it remained for Gideonsy to sail in and seek to divest Beard of all claims to any standing as an historical scholar. Just why Gideonsy should presume to pass on questions of historiography and degrade historians is not quite evident, though he has been doing so for some years. Professionally, though admittedly a very talented classroom orator and effective rabble-rouser of the student body, he was only a somewhat obscure economist when he strode into Flatbush with his mace. But Gideonsy did not hesitate to administer a sharp slap to the members of the American Historical Association, who had elected Beard to their presidency in 1933 by poo-pooing the general scholarly opinion that Beard was the dean of living American historians. This notion and pretension, says Gideonsy, is purely fictitious. Actually, according to Gideonsy, Beard has only been a lifelong pamphleteer, and his books on Roosevelt's foreign policy are cheap journalism. In the light of all this, one could read with considerable amusement and sardonic humor an announcement in the New York Times of September the 8th, 1948, that Gideonsy opened the college year at Flatbush with an address to entering freshmen in which he gravely and sternly assured that the truthfulness is a main and indispensable quality of a college teacher, one which does not, perhaps, extend to college presidents. There were many other attacks on Beard's last two great books. They usually took one of two forms. First, they were efforts to dispose of them by brief, casual, Jovian, or flippant smears without giving any attention whatever to the facts or meaning the arguments of the books. Such was Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s smear in the Partisan Review, implying that Beard sought to justify collaboration with the Nazis. Max Lerner's snore to the effect that they were two rather weird affairs. Perry Miller's description of them as two frenetic indictments of Franklin Roosevelt, implying if Miller knew the meaning of the words he was using, that Beard must have been insane, and Quincy writes, even briefer disposition of them as a strange argument, strange presumably to write, and that the argument was based on facts. The other type of approach has been to smear the book under a vast welter of side issues, non sequiturs, and irrelevant scoldings. This was well illustrated by the procedure of Charles C. Griffin, an expert on Latin American history, who was selected to review Beard's last book for the American Historical Review. He buried the book under 4.5 pages of impenetrable, irrelevant, and disapproving fog, rarely coming to grips with the essential facts and arguments. While the only fair and scholarly review that the book has received was by the chief authority in the field, Charles C. Tansel, in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. On the occasion of Beard's death, one might have supposed that the opportunity would have been taken to pay a tribute to his greatness as a teacher, historian, political scientist, and liberal, at least in those journals to which Beard had been for years one of the most honored contributors, and that there would have been articles by writers who had long been admirers of Beard, until he began to examine Roosevelt's foreign policy. Instead of this, we are treated to an obscene performance which reminded fair observers of jackals and hyenas howling over about the body of a dead lion, especially in a point where the articles by Max Lerner in the New Republic, October the 25th, and November the 1st, 1948, by Harry Miller in The Nation, September the 25th, 1948, and by Peter Levin in Tomorrow, March 1949. In these articles, most of the smears which had been irresponsibly thrown at Beard during the previous several years were amalgamated, and he was portrayed as a senile, embittered, and confused isolationist and a traitor to the liberal cause. There was even an effort to undermine confidence in Beard's monumental books which had preceded his volumes on the foreign policy of President Roosevelt. Lerner held up to ridicule Beard's social and civic ideal, a continental economy spaciously conceived, controlled in a common-sense way, yielding a gracious life without all the horrors of foreign entanglements. As of 1953, such an ideal might well evoke the heartiest enthusiasm on the part of any thoughtful American. Lerner characterized Roosevelt's foreign policy as a consistent attempt to promote the collective democratic will, reluctantly having to shape a world in which it could survive. How well it succeeded in achieving this result will be apparent from an examination of Chamberlain's America's Second Crusade in Chapter 8 of this volume. The campaign of vilification and distortion against Beard has continued long after his death. One of the most absurd attacks appeared in 1952 in a book by John B. Harrison, a teacher of history at Michigan State College, entitled The Age of Global Strife. Harrison writes, the prominent historian undertook in the last days of his eccentric old age to prove by ponderous documentation that President Roosevelt set out from the beginning of the war in Europe to stealthily and deceitfully maneuver the United States into a war whose outcome was of no real concern to the American people. It is a deplorable collection of half-truths and distortions. Anyone who reads it should read also Samuel E. Morrison's brilliant analysis of it in the Atlantic Monthly, August 1948. Let's see here. All right, where were we? 1948. A book containing material of this sort should be published by the old and reputable firm of Lippincott 7 years after VJ Day. The reception, according to Chamberlain's America's Second Crusade, was in keeping with the blackout procedure and in line with that given to the Morgenstern and Beard volumes. Chamberlain was a too important and well-known author to be given the silent treatment by all newspapers and periodicals. Though the leading liberal periodicals tended to ignore his book, it was naturally glowingly praised in the Chicago Tribune and equally lavishly smeared by the New York Post. The New York Times treated the book about as badly as feasible under the circumstances. While it placed a long review of the slight book by the elder Schlesinger on page 3 of the Sunday Book Review, it relegated Chamberlain's striking volume to page 34. It chose as the reviewer of the book Samuel Flagg Bemis, well known as perhaps the bitterest critic of revisionist writing among the historians. But even Bemis was unable to make much headway against Chamberlain's facts and logic. He frankly admitted that he would not argue the case with Mr. Chamberlain. In reviewing the Morgenstern book, Bemis had written that the American situation in late 1941 constituted the most awful danger that ever confronted our nation. He still stuck to this thesis despite the admission that there was no factual basis for it. that captured Nazi archives do not reveal any actual plans to attack the New World. As Mr. Chamberlain repeatedly stresses, does not make any difference. The intention was there. Bemis pictured Germany and Japan as the two colossi whose powers and victory would have closed on our freedom with inexorable jaws of a global vice. Therefore, our Second Crusade was a success and a necessity, even though Bemis admits that Russia is now more powerful than Japan and Germany combined could ever have become, and its power is concentrated in one nation rather than being divided among two who might often have clashed. Stalin has stepped into everything that Hitler and Japan started out to get and more. Soviet Russia has rolled up an agglomeration of power greater than ever menaced the United States, even in 1941. All right, I want to see where we want to end this. I think we'll end it here. So we'll end it on page 40. All right, everybody. So we got in the chat. All Alone in the Woods. Hello. GF, hello. Mass Creation Broadcast. Hello. Mass Creation Broadcast. I just started paying attention to the series. I thought it was a live stream with a guest about an actual blackout. Lol. Well, it's a historical blackout. Conquest Home, great book here. Yes, indeed. All right, everyone, make sure to tune in for part 5 of the Historical Blackout next week, same time. This is Todd Lewis, Praise of Light Podcast, signing off.